practices that are being promoted. And so our relationships needs to be constant. It needs to be constantly growing the way a rice stem grows, right? Our roots are constantly spreading. And so to me, the idea is to create a way to envision society without borders, a way to envision society that's not divided by the language you speak, but that we can recognize each other throughout multiple and recognize the beautiful symphony that we can create with the multiple ways of being, the multiple places that we represent, that we participate and live in.
Thank you. Tyler, do you have a question?
Yeah, I've got a question that relates to both of you. I feel like when you were telling your story about the Oaxacan uprising and the way that women and children took over the TV station, and it's an incredibly powerful narrative that articulates the importance of a public or community-based media sector. And I feel like in some ways the CBC, in having like a very culturally situated, very powerful historical narrative as well, it also has that on its side. So, and I'm just wondering, maybe Jean, you can speak to this first, and if Sylvia, if you want to jump in, about how much in your work at the CMG do you hear the history or the value of, or the narrative of the CBC as something, as like an argument or a strategy for securing a future for the CBC, and sort of like maybe what we can learn between narrative, like the narrative of taking over a Oaxacan television station as an advocacy tactic, narrativizing the CBC. So.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think it depends on where you are. For example, in Newfoundland, there is a really intense connection among workers at the CBC to the history of Newfoundland as a separate country, and as a result, and Newfoundland had its own public broadcasting before it joined Canada, and so the CBC and the Newfoundland broadcaster, whose name I don't remember, kind of joined together, and as a result, Newfoundland has, I believe, more stations than any other province. Which, if you think about the size of Newfoundland compared to, say, the size of BC, which I think is in second, although I would confess to not knowing very much about how many stations are in Quebec, because we don't represent people in Quebec. So that history of, well, we are this small outpost. We don't necessarily trust this larger country to own our narratives, to own our stories, to know our stories, and we're owning this public broadcaster, and we're going to talk in our own voices. That's really strong there, and it's also strong in smaller communities. But in places like I lived in Toronto until July, so I have more knowledge of Toronto than really any other city. Certainly Toronto has a problem feeling rooted, generally speaking, and I would say that the way that CBC's narrative of past and place and its importance in what it means to be here on this land is very different and kind of absent in Toronto, and also in part because people end up in Toronto after their histories of working in lots of different places together.
I just want to say that I recognize the difficulties, because most of us in living through this colonial time are not raised and are not we are not taught to honor those places we belong, those places that give birth to our ideas, to our imagination. And so unless we're able to fall in love with the place where you are, how are you going to care about that place? How are you going to protect that place? How are you going to relate to the other beings that share that place with you? And I think that is an important challenge for all of us. Throughout the world, you see it being done over and over. Wherever you go, whether you're in Latin America or in Africa, people constantly tell you about the places where they come from. They recognize each other by the places, and the places that shape us and shape our understanding of ourselves. And so I think it's part of the resistance, it's part of learning that we are constantly having to resist a hegemonic way of being that says we're individuals and not community, that says we are commodities that need to sell something to survive, and not collaborative, and communities that can grow and nurture based on reciprocity and ways of being that respect each other.
I now want to just give a chance for the audience to ask the hardest questions of the day, and we have about 20 minutes to do a little bit of discussion with the audience. Does anyone want to start? Maybe just raise your hand, and I'll try to keep track of an order. So, sir in the front.
I think it's been a very interesting afternoon. We've heard a lot about money. We've heard a lot about a lot of things, but we haven't heard anything about political action, with using the word politics as a way of getting where we need to go. I would be interested in knowing how we can get there. Because Canada has put in power in Ottawa, the Canadian people have allowed this all to happen. The Canadian people have allowed this. It wasn't taken over with the muzzle of a gun or with a dollar sign. The Canadian people allowed it by being non-political.
Well, sorry, 30% of Canadians. Harper's majority is hardly valid, but you raise a very good point in terms of it is a political problem that, we've been talking a lot about sort of the concept of like what public media is and how we give people a sense of value over it, but in terms of actually operationalizing that value and making sure that it sustains, it is a policy solution. There are policy solutions and electoral solutions and organizing solutions, and I think a lot of the stories that Sylvia has told have been, at least for me, very instructive in that respect. They're stories of organizing. They're stories of getting your feet on the ground, sitting in rooms with people, developing strategies, working with other organizations, and occupying spaces, whether it's a public square, or whether it's a voting booth, or whether it's a review panel for a policy submission, whether it's a hearing on the long-term sustainability of the Community Media Fund. It's that the necessity, the absolute necessity of organizing. And that's a political tactic that I don't think, and that we need to weave the value of public media into as a way of mobilizing people, but without the actual organizing that Sylvia has talked about, and without the work of people like Jean, who are hearing from workers, who are hearing from staff, who are hearing from citizens all across the country. We need to bring those different forms of knowledge and experience together to create coalitions, strategic coalitions that can actually affect the policy solutions that we're going to need to secure a future for public media.
So now I'm going to actually call out the CBC. One of the I think the real challenges that the CBC has is that it's really difficult to cover yourself and look neutral. It is impossible to write a story and as a CBC journalist and say, Harper, you're killing us, and look neutral. And so what happens is the CBC has an extremely difficult time saying, all of these things are going to kill us unless you do something. It's very difficult as someone who's trying to be a professional, non-biased, neutral, whatever you need, throw as many quotation marks as you need on that, and say, listen, public, you need to get up, you need to get angry, because if you don't, I'm not going to be here. And so I think that is the major catch-22 that CBC is in, because it already gets so much crap for not being neutral enough, that if it were to actually stand on its own feet and say, you know what, I can't take this anymore, you're not pushing me around, well, that would just be, privatization right there. So it really is a very difficult road to walk down. And so what that means is that the CBC isn't going to stand up for itself. And it's very challenging for us as a labor union, kind of separate from the CBC, we aren't necessarily the people that some of our members want us to be doing the standing up, and some of our members are really uncomfortable with us doing the standing up because it looks like, oh, well, you're just standing up for the CBC because of our jobs. And then, you know, you get the whole, oh, and then labor unions are in bed with the CBC thing. And, you know, that, of course, looks even better to conservatives. So we really are kind of stuck in this place. And so that's how many, many years ago, Friends of Public Broadcasting, that started out as Friends of CBC, was actually a coalition started by a predecessor of our union, because the public doesn't listen to the union of the people that are hurting. The public doesn't listen to the city employees union when there are cuts happening because they assume it's about self-interest and not about protecting public services. So, I mean, it is a question that we haven't quite gotten our minds around, and part of the way that we've dealt with it is by partnering with organizations like OpenMedia, partnering with organizations like Reimagine CBC, and Friends of Public Broadcasting. But we can't do it alone, and we need other people to be standing up. And this is part of why I'm telling you this, is because you can't wait for us to do it. Because we can't, because you won't listen if we do.
I want to answer your question because I think part of the reason CBC and many other institutions are in the situation they are is because the public has not found a voice in them. And I think that's self-criticism, and we have to own up to that. Because it doesn't mean that we come out and hold a banner. My radio station loves to use the word objective. You have to be objective. You know, and yet every single one of us has been raised with particular views. We have strong views about anything, you know, whether organic food is good or bad, I don't, take your pick. The point I'm making is that when we even silence those voices from coming in, I would argue that the cross-country checkup is a political show. It's an organizing show. It politically organizes the right. But where is our show? Where is our show on the CBC radio? Where is the one for radical views of people who are calling for, you know, progressive movements such as, you know, having a participatory economics that organizes at the local level, where funding is not sent to a centralized government that then dictates who gets what, but rather people, according to their needs, decide how they're going to organize, what kind of development is right, creating endogenous development. All of these ideas are out there. There are 1 million people already working on this. So the problem I see is that under this perceived or mask of neutrality, we are silencing the people who are organizing. So the media is a political vehicle, absolutely. The media is used at the moment to entrench the power and privilege of a few, absolutely. We know that. So the question is, at what point are we going to start to pretend that the CBC radio is somehow higher than, you know, honestly, I want to know that we have a media that is responsive to the people on the ground. We have a media that's responsive to the multiple movements that are facing great repression. People are being arrested. You know, indigenous people are being arrested in Algonquin for blocking clear cutting. You know, indigenous people are being arrested here in Vancouver, in British Columbia, for blocking, you know, the destruction of Fish Lake, for, you know, preventing mining companies from just expanding their operations. So all of these things are not insignificant. So that I think is what the political component of this comes. If we are telling those stories, we will not only be doing our responsibility, right, but we're also